Okay. Hi, my name is Phil Francis. Thank you for joining us here today. I was once the Deputy Superintendent of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park for about 11 years and spent about 8 years on the Blue Ridge Parkway. Grew up in North Carolina where I could see the Blue Ridge Parkway from 50 miles away. And visibility and air quality has been an important part of my life for a long, long time. When I first arrived in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park way back in 1994, I was surprised to learn that some days we could only see for about 6 miles. And then later I learned of the health problems that was occurring around Tennessee and the Smokies region as a consequence of poor air quality. So air quality is important. And so with me today, I have 3 outstanding experts who work for the National Parks Conservation Association. And with that, I want to turn this over to Ulla Reeves. I think, Ulla, you're the Interim Clear Air Program Manager. Is that right?
Yeah, Director, yes.
Director,
Right.
okay, got it right now. All right.
Thank you, Phil. I really appreciate the introduction and the warm welcome. It's a pleasure to be with you all today. We have a new report that we have recently launched and an interactive website. So we'll just jump right in. I want to make sure, I think a lot of you are quite familiar, but if we'll pop to the next slide, I'll just give a little quick background for anyone who's unfamiliar. NPCA is the National Parks Conservation Association, and we are the leading advocacy voice for America's national parks. We work to protect and preserve our nation's most iconic and inspirational places for present and future generations. For over 100 years, we have celebrated the parks. We work tirelessly to defend them, whether it's on the ground or through rulemaking or in the courtroom or on Capitol Hill. And we have more than 1.6 million members and supporters beside us and staff located from coast to coast and everywhere in between, working on the many issues and challenges facing our national parks, many of which we will talk about today. So next slide. With me today are our core team members of NPCA's Clean Air team. So I am Ulla Reeves, the interim director for the clean air work at NPCA, and Natalie Levine is our interim campaigns director, and Danielle Orozco is our senior air and climate manager and our data expert for all of the polluted parks analysis. So you'll be hearing from each of us today. I will give just a quick introduction to the report and the work that we've just released, and then Danielle will cover the details of the polluted parks analysis for the categories of air quality and climate change. And I will share some information about the interactive website and the resources that we have available. And Natalie will cover key points from our solutions and recommendations section. And then we'll turn to your questions. But that said, please feel free to use the chat or the Q&A throughout our presentation to submit questions. We will be attentive, and if there are some questions that we can answer in real time, we will be glad to do so. So let's jump in. So last week, we launched this new Polluted Parks, which is a 2-part interactive website and report entitled How Air Pollution and Climate Change Continue to Harm America's National Parks. We released this this report as a follow-up to our 2019 analysis. So there are some direct correlations, and we can see some changes from last time, particularly in the air quality categories, and Danielle will talk all about that. The climate section is quite different and not directly comparable to our 2019 report. We'll also talk about that. but this is a follow-up from our 2019 work. The data underlying all of our work here is directly from the National Park Service and reveals ongoing challenges from both direct and indirect consequences of air pollution and climate change that are affecting the health of our national parks. So while we looked at two distinct data sets, they dovetail very well together because the pollution causing climate change is air pollution. And this report illustrates the consequences of all the air pollution on the parks, the direct consequences being from the sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxides that cause haze and are deposited into soil and water, ozone that harms people's lungs as well as plants and nature, and indirectly as carbon dioxide, methane, and other greenhouse gases are fueling our rapidly intensifying climate crisis. And you all know national parks are home to some of our most epic and wild natural landscapes and ecosystems, as well as some of our most delicate and ecologically sensitive. And they are also home to some of our nation's most pertinent histories and cultural events that are memorialized in our historic sites and monuments. And despite their treasured status, they are far from immune from the consequences that are posed from the problems of air pollution. Our findings show that we are making some progress toward cleaning the air in national parks and across the nation. Our collective work over the decades has really paid off. Thanks, Don Barger. And but what we see here is that the cumulative consequences of air pollution are a unique threat to ecosystems and nature. And the threats of climate change, new emission sources, and the failures to clean up existing pollution all pose massive challenges to achieving our goals of clean air, clear skies, and a healthy climate. But we know that when we work together to hold states, polluters, and EPA and other decision makers accountable, we can achieve critical gains in reduced pollution, cleaner air, and we can help fight the climate crisis. So we've seen some really great recent gains in that regard, and we have tools in our toolbox like the regional haze rule and the National Ambient Air Quality Standards under the Clean Air Act that Natalie will talk more about. But together we can make that progress, and I hope that our findings today are inspiration for us all to keep doing this good work. So with that, I will turn it over to Danielle to dive deeper into our findings. So thanks again so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Ulla, and hi everyone. Excited to be here discussing with you the findings of this report. As Ulla mentioned, we have this report is divided in two parts: air climate change and air quality. So I'll start with air quality first. So for this section, we use data from the National Park Service from the Air Resources Division. We got data for 399 parks. This is air quality, and we look at three main categories, which are hazy skies, unhealthy air, and harm to nature. I'm going to explain those in detail. We look at 5-year average data ending in 2021 for all of the categories. And for each park, there is a level of concern for each category. And we call them significant concern, unsatisfactory, and low concern. Here you can see the categories with the icons that we designed for this report. And I'm going to talk about, in a general way, about the main findings, and then I'm going to dive into each of the specific categories. We saw some improvements as we compared this data with the report, with the same report that we released in 2019. The improvements have been seen in the categories of hazy skies and unhealthy air, specifically because the number of parks reaching significant concern levels have reduced. Unfortunately, we did not see any improvement in the harm to nature category. As you can see, a great amount of parks are still facing significant concern levels for this category. When we look at the percentages of parks, either in the significant concern or unsatisfactory levels, this is the percentage that we get. In other words, these percentages are showing everything that is not low concern or parks that are not experiencing optimal air quality conditions. So from here, we get the average of 97% of parks struggling with air quality. Okay, I'm going to continue explaining all of this in more detail. So let's start with hazy skies. This category refers to visibility pollution that reduces the clarity and distance of scenic views across landscapes, which is impacting visitors' experience in national parks. The data for this category comes from the improved monitors. These monitors collect particle matter and that is eventually analyzed for chemical composition. Out of this analysis, a metric called deciview is obtained, and the deciview it helps to measure, or is a measure to tell you the visibility impairment in a particular park. The greater the deciview, the greater the visibility impairment. So what we have seen in this, in terms of the findings, is first of all that only 4 parks showed significant concern levels for hazy skies. And this was a very exciting finding to see such a small number of parks in this particular level. In the previous report, this number was 66. So that means a 94% reduction in the number of parks in the significant concern level. So we were really excited to see that. However, as you can see in the second level, unsatisfactory, most of the park, that is 97% of the parks are in the unsatisfactory level, with only a handful of parks in the low concern. So even though we've seen some improvements, we also noticed that the number of parks experiencing optimal air quality or optimal visibility condition is still way, way too low. Here are some examples of the parks. The table on the left shows those 5 parks for which hazy skies was of low concern. So these are the parks with best visibility based on this data. And the table on the right shows those parks, were the top 10 actually parks with the worst visibility. And all this ranking is based on the deciview values obtained out of the improved monitors. The second category is unhealthy air, and this category refers to ozone pollution levels that are affecting the health of staff and visitors in national parks. This data comes from ozone monitors measured in parts per billion, and the data is average and is processed in the same in a consistent way with the national ambient air quality standards for ozone. So concentrations that are above the 70 ppb are allocated in the significant concern level. Levels between 55 and 70 ppb are unsatisfactory, and levels below 54 ppb are in the low concern level. Here in this category, we also saw some improvements. The number of parks in the significant concern level, even though it's much higher than in the hazy skies, from 4 to 42, we've seen a reduction. The number of parks in the previous report in the significant concern level was 87. So that means a 52% reduction. But also similarly to the previous category, 85% of the parks are reading unsatisfactory conditions for ozone, and only a dozen of parks, which is only 3% of parks, are experiencing optimal air quality conditions for ozone. These two tables here show on the left the top best national parks for unhealthy air. These are the about 10 parks that showed low concern levels, and the table on the right shows the top 10 national parks with the worst unhealthy air. And again, this ranking is based on the concentration, the ppb concentration. So particularly for the table on the right, those parks, and there are some others, and that are consistently reading concentration above the 70 ppb standard. So, visitors and staff in certain times are breathing air that is not healthy for the lungs and the respiratory system. And here, out of the table behind that I just showed, the top 4 parks with the worst air quality for ozone are in California: Sequoia, Joshua Tree, Mojave, and Kings Canyon. The last category in terms of air quality is harm to nature, and this category refers to air pollution affecting sensitive species and ecosystem in parks. This data comes from 3 specific data sets. One is sulfur deposition, nitrogen deposition, and ozone impacts on vegetation. Before I dive into all those details, I'm gonna talk a little bit about the general findings. First of all, we did not see any improvements in this category, as I mentioned. 276 parks, that is almost 70% of the parks are facing or struggling with significant concern levels for this in this category, and only 6 parks show low concern levels for both all of them: nitrogen, sulfur deposition, and ozone health. Now, as I mentioned, nitrogen and sulfur deposition are included in this data. I'm going to explain briefly how that, what we mean by that. So, industries, vehicles, and agriculture emit either nitrogen or sulfur compounds. These compounds interact in the atmosphere with other components and eventually are washed out from the atmosphere and settle back down in the air surface, affecting water and soil, and also species that depend on these resources. The way we measure these particular components are through annual precipitation deposition by annual precipitation in kilograms per hectare. And also in terms of ozone and vegetation health, what we refer here is to the impacts of ozone on plants. The same ozone that we measure for unhealthy air is analyzed in a different way so that it speaks and explain the impacts that ozone has on vegetation. On the right, we can see a couple of leaves, one that has been exposed to high levels of ozone, and you can see clear damage due to the high levels of ozone. So in other words, ozone weakens the plant and affects the plant's ability to do photosynthesis, and the plant can eventually wither and die or can be overcome by other invasive species. So out of these, the infographic in the center shows how the data was distributed with the different levels, and we can see that nitrogen deposition is the driver that is causing the infographic in the top to have so many parks in the significant concern level. So all of them are actually causing issues in park, but nitrogen deposition is clearly the one that is causing more damage. And one thing to keep in mind here is that emissions from agriculture, ammonia specifically, are having a significant impact on this particular measurement. Here I'm showing only those parks that are facing or dealing with the for the three categories: nitrogen deposition, sulfur deposition, and vegetation health, that show significant concern level. Those are Carlsbad Caverns, Great Sand Dunes, and Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks. So out of all the parks, these are the parks that show significant concern for these 3 particular pollutants. Here I'm showing you the maps of where the parks that we looked at, 399 parks. You have an idea of the location of where these parks are, and also the specific concern levels. As I mentioned at the beginning, we were excited to see some improvements in the hazy skies and healthy air categories. Didn't see any improvement in harm to nature, but one takeaway message from this image here is that the number of parks that you see in this map in green color is extremely small. So it's even sometimes hard to find those green dots. So this speaks about the improvements that has taken place, but also speaks about all the significant amount of work that needs to be done to bring these parks to enjoy and experience better air quality in the future. So that's my that's the finish of the air quality. Now I'm gonna switch to climate change. For the climate change section of our report, we also use data from the Park Service, specifically from the Climate Change Response Program. And the data here is based on a study called the Climate Vulnerability of National Parks to Climate Change. We look at 397 parks. And even though this study, the vulnerability study is a very comprehensive and looks at parks vulnerability in terms of climate change from different angles, we looked specifically at the high-risk climate threats. Those threats are invasive species, wildfire, drought, and sea level rise. Now, I want to clarify that in terms of climate change, there are many other threats impacting parks. But according to the research and according to the Park Service study, these 4 threats are crucial or are key because these 4 threats can change park ecosystem and resources fundamentally and permanently. So parks can be damaged in way that cannot be bring back to their native or original conditions once they are hit by any of these threats. For invasive species, the study refers to insects or diseases affecting vegetation in parks. It does not include invasive plants or weeds, which are also big problems for parks. Again, it's only insects and diseases affecting parks. For wildfire, it refers to the frequency and probability of wildfire episodes in parks. For drought, it refers to the number of drought events in park areas. And for sea level rise, it refers to the percentage of park areas inundated by sea level rise or storm surge. Now, here is the main findings of that analysis of climate change. We found that 57% of all national parks face a high risk from at least one of these climate threats, with invasive species being the threat that is harming more parks, with 11 and 13 parks impacted. Now, before I continue, I want to talk about this 57% number. Even though it may not look like a huge number to you, 57% is actually very troublesome and very concerning. I want to remind you that these 4 threats have the potential to change parks and resources in ways that are irreversible. So what we are seeing is that more than half, actually close to 60% of the parks are already being threatened by these serious threats. So, and not only so, but some parks are actually facing more than one threat at the same time. For example, this table here shows 14 parks that are facing 3 threats simultaneously. The most common threats were drought, wildfire, and invasive species. And as you can see, these parks in particular are really having a difficult time to cope with all the impacts of climate from different perspectives. Finally, my last slide shows the location of the parks along with the different threats identified for them. One quickly thing we can see here is that wildfire and drought threats were identified mostly in the western states. Sea level rise was mostly identified in the Gulf and eastern coasts, and invasive species was pretty much scattered all over the parks with high presence in the Midwest and eastern state because of the type of vegetation and conditions. So again, this map shows a huge number of parks threatened by serious consequences of climate change. So also, this speaks about the urgency to continue working, making sure emissions are reduced, not only to improve climate change, but also to mitigate climate change impacts as the ones we're seeing in this particular data. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Ulla, who's going to show you where you can find all of this data.
Thanks, Danielle. All right, I know this is a lot of information, so just a reminder to please feel free to use the Q&A if anything's coming up for you that you'd like clarification on. So I mentioned at the top of our time together that the interactive website is a big piece of our release from last week. And what I want to do is just quickly show you some of the pieces of the interactive website and how to use it. And we can share with you all the link to the page, and we have many other materials and information that we can also share the links for. So next slide, please. So when you come to our landing page for polluted parks, at the very top of the page, you'll get a link to download the PDF report. That report has all the text and narrative, a lot of the information that Danielle just shared, all of that information. So please download that, take a look at it and read it. If you come further down in the interactive webpage, you'll see these dials pop up and the climate change box on the right. When you hover over these dials, the numbers will pop up with the percentages of parks that are falling into the various concern levels based on these categories. I will point out that the names are a little bit different on the website than they are in the report and what you just heard. The visibility category is the hazy skies category. The health one here is unhealthy air. And the nature category, of course, is harm to nature. And when you click on either of these dials or the climate change box, you will go to separate pages to get more detailed information about which parks are falling into those various categories. Next slide. So when you click through, then you'll come, if you were to click through on the nature dial, you would end up on a page that looks like this, and you'll see the number of parks by number instead of percentage that are falling into the significant concern category, unsatisfactory and low concern. And each of the parks are linkable and clickable down below here. And you can also use the Find My Park tool or the See All Parks button to get even more information about a particular park that you're interested in. So next slide. And here on the bottom left, if you click all the way through to a particular park that you're interested, you'll see that when you get to that park page, all of the information about where in our findings, where that park lands, all of that information for both air quality and climate change are showing up on that slide. And parks that have significant levels of concern or are identified as in a high risk climate threat category, they are marked with exclamation marks. And on the top right, you can see a snapshot of a case study. So on our interactive website, there are 5 distinct case studies where we tell a deeper story about a particular park, and we share, again, all of the information about what the findings are for that particular park. The parks that you'll find there are Indiana Dunes and Mammoth Cave, Sequoia and Kings Canyon, Everglades, and Guadalupe Mountains. Next slide. And here's just another example of we have information on all of the parks, of course, and here's another infographic that we've created that are shareable. If there's any particular park that you are interested in or concerned about, we have these available for a number of parks, and here's just a few examples of how they look that are pulling all of the findings together in one place. Next slide. Danielle, did you want to talk about this? Or do you want me to keep going?
Yes, please, if you want to keep going, that's fine.
Okay. So I know that some folks had been interested in particular parks, so I think that that was the slide before as well. Anybody who's interested in Rocky Mountain or Great Sand Dunes, that was that information. And then I think some folks were potentially interested in the Arizona park. So we pulled the information here for the Arizona park, so you can see those findings here. And then also the Blue Ridge Parkway data is here as at the outset. Phil mentioned his personal connection to the Blue Ridge Parkway. So we pulled this information and you can see what the findings are for those particular parks. And we're happy to share this slide deck with anybody or share any of these particular park pieces of information if it's helpful. So I think that's it for me at this point. I'm turning it over to Natalie.
Thanks, Ulla and Danielle. It's lovely to be with you all today. My name is Natalie Levine. I'm the Interim Campaign Director for the Clean Air Program at NPCA, beaming in from California. Through advocacy with this report, we'd like to continue some of the successes we've seen in our clean air advocacy over the years. For example, in the first round of implementation of the regional haze rule, which we work very closely on, we achieved some impressive emissions reductions in coalition with you and partners all over the country. Millions of tons of visibility impairing pollution were reduced, as well as the closure or cleanup of over 150 park polluting coal plants. So we want to build on some of that great success and continue advocating together for new action for decision makers to make in the coming months, weeks, and years. Next slide. So a few of the solutions and recommendations we're recommending through this report are advocacy actions that you all can help us with. So a few are noted here. These are also written in the report. But just a few things I'd like to highlight. Again, the Regional Haze Rule is a program whose goal is to return a number of national parks and wilderness areas back to their natural visibility. So that is a program that we work on a lot in partnership with you all to ensure that emissions are being reduced from polluters in states all over the country that are impacting national parks and wilderness areas specifically. So we're currently in the second round of haze planning, and we're hoping that states and polluters can be held accountable for strong plans. We're also looking to the third round of planning for that program, which will start in 2028, and ensuring that the rule is strengthened for those future rounds of planning. I think Ulla also mentioned NPCA works on a number of new and updated federal regulations, as well as some state regulations. So we are working to ensure emissions cuts from particular sectors, including vehicles, heavy-duty trucks, power plants, and oil and gas infrastructure. We're also working to establish strong national air quality standards, building on the recent success of a proposed primary standard for particulate matter, as well as a final rule on methane emissions reductions from oil and gas infrastructure that was released last week. And finally, we are working as hard as we can to get the National Park Service and the EPA adequate and robust funding for air monitoring and infrastructure. So a lot of the data that we pulled, most of the data we pulled for this report, especially the air quality data, came from the Park Service and came from their air quality equipment and data management. And we know that a lot of that equipment infrastructure is old and aging and needs repairs. So we're working to get more funding for those systems to be replaced and updated, and to, of course, ensure enough staff to run the programs and monitor and provide us all with the data. So those are some of the things we're working on, and hope that you will join us. Next slide. So this is a fun graphic, just a good visual representation of how NPCA does its work, again, in partnership with you all and other partners across the country. We work in a variety of ways to advocate for clean air, and we hope that you'll join us. We have a current action alert that we can share with you that you can just sign your own note to Administrator Regan at the EPA, and you can also share that with your networks. It's thanking him and his administration for the recent rules on PM and methane, but then urging urgent action on regional haze plans that are pending in front of the EPA. And just thinking in the next couple of years, looking out to 2024 and 2025, there will be ample opportunity for engagement in regional haze plans and other federal air quality regulation implementation. We're expecting the EPA to act on over 30 regional haze plans in the coming 18 to 24 months, which would mean opportunities to comment on many of the do-nothing haze plans that have been submitted by states to the EPA, and urging the EPA to hold these states and polluters accountable for their emissions reductions. And as we mentioned, as I just mentioned, we'll be expecting the implementation of multiple air quality regulations, including the PM primary standard and those EPA methane regulations. And some of that implementation will require additional public input and engagement. So we'd be happy to keep you all updated on those opportunities. You can reach any of us on our email addresses on the slides, or through Teresa, Amy, or Emily can find us. And then hopefully we'll be running a poll here shortly, where if you are interested in engaging with NPCA, you can let us know with your contact information and then what type of engagement you'd like to help us with. So I'm seeing things in the Q&A box that I can help monitor here.
Thanks, Natalie. I can take a shot at starting to answer some of these questions, if that sounds good.
Sure. Why don't you just make sure you read them in case folks don't have the Q&A open?
Absolutely. Okay, so the first question that I'm seeing is, given your opening statements about reductions in concern, it raises the question of objectivity. What questions are asked in the surveys and how subjective are the answers? I'm not totally sure what surveys the questioner is asking about. But let me just share a little bit about the reductions that we've mentioned that the data show and how we came to identify that. So in the air quality categories that Danielle went over, we are doing direct comparisons between our 2019 report and the data that we had available for this time around. And so we are, and I'll actually invite Danielle to explain a little bit more about how we did those comparisons. But I just want to reiterate that the data that underlies our report is directly from the National Park Service. And in each category, there are distinct breakdowns of how parks fall into the different concern levels. So while the interpretation of the concern level is ours, the data that underlies them is consistent and is what is used across the board for EPA, within the Park Service, and other advocates for the deciview category for hazy skies, ozone levels for the unhealthy air category, and then Danielle shared the deposition information. Is there anything else, Danielle, that you would share on this particular piece?
I think that's good, Ulla. I just want to clarify that there is significant science and background regarding the specific levels. It's not something that we chose just because. I mean, there's enough background and enough information that justify those thresholds. In fact, those specific thresholds for each of the categories has been used by the Park Service in all of the data analysis, and is consistent with the visibility metrics, is consistent with the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, is consistent with the critical loads of nitrogen, sulfur, and also vegetation. So there's ample science that back up those specific thresholds, even though we could even, come up with specific different levels. We stick to what is already consistent across the board.
And Danielle, there's a corresponding question here, which is, has NPS aggregated this information? And if so, how is their report different than NPCA's? Do you want to take that?
Sure, absolutely. NPS, it doesn't have a polluted parks report or a report that talks about the air quality in the parks in the way we did it. We got their data and we created a report. However, you could definitely go to the NPS website called Air Quality Trends and Conditions, and you will be able to find the same data that we have, in which you're gonna have, say, Sequoia dealing with high levels of ozone, nitrogen, and sulfur deposition, and visibility. So it's basically the same information. We organize it and put it in a nice report for all of you to digest that information much better. What you have in the Park Service is just data. What we have is out of the data created a report.
Great, thank you. All right, let me tackle Don Barger's question. So visibility improvement. So Don's question is, visibility improvement on track with the glide path has occurred due to the early focus of EGUs and other major sources. Could we talk about how that begins to shift the task before us for continued progress moving forward? Okay, so Don's question is specific to the regional haze rule that we've mentioned as one of the solutions before us, one of the policy resources that we have available. The regional haze rule is intended specifically to protect national parks, and the end goal is to deliver natural air quality free of man-made pollution from the national parks. And so the glide path that he's mentioning is where we start at the top corner of our chart and get parks down to natural level of visibility. So some parks are seeming to be on this glide path of making good progress. The problem with that glide path, even though we have seen some improvements, and we mentioned those improvements, we've mentioned them multiple times here, we are making progress. But in the regional haze rule, there are different provisions over time that states must be working toward to make continued reasonable progress to regularly revisit the pollution sources in any state that are harming any particular national park. So states are supposed to be every 10 years looking at their pollution sources and identifying ongoing ways of reducing air pollution. So even though we have made some progress, it should not mean that states are done. There are always new sources. There are always opportunities for continuing to reduce emissions, particularly on older facilities. We see lots of problems even with old pollution controls that were installed at some point in time aren't as good now and need to be revisited. So the whole point of the regional haze program is to continue to make progress. So that's where we are at this point, is trying to get states to continue to look for ways to reduce additional pollution that's causing haze. So hopefully I answered your question, Dawn. Okay, next question is, how is the impact of heat both on the park and its environment and the visitors being studied? I'm not sure that we get into all of that, but I'm going to let Danielle take this for the most part.
Sure, yes. The climate study actually used 47 climate indicators. Many of them are related to temperature changes and heat waves, specifically in parks. So even though these are only indicators, basically it's like you put a thermometer and you measure how the temperature in park changes. But that's only a metric, that's only a measure. What this study did is not only to measure or to analyze the measurements, but also understand how the park is impacted or affected by these particular changes in temperature and heat waves, and also what is the capacity of the park to adapt. So those are definitely taken into consideration, and in particular, heat waves and changes in temperature are strongly related to drought and wildfire. So so definitely they have been studied, they have been included in the analysis. I don't think visitors have been included in the study. This was only looking at park resources, either living resources or monuments, kind of non-living resources in parks. But when I mean living, it refers to wildlife, vegetation, water resources, but not necessarily visitors. Even though we acknowledge that climate change for sure is impacting visitors when they go there, and there is a heat wave, for instance, or things like that. People can be impacted, but that wasn't quantified in this particular analysis.
Great, thanks, Danielle. Okay, hi, Gary. Your question, microplastics have emerged as threats to life, such as toxins damaging DNA and exacerbating chronic diseases. How are parks monitoring microplastics in air, water, soil, and biota? I do not know the answer to this question. Danielle, I don't know if you are familiar with this, but we can get the answer for you, but this is not something that our team is expert at, and I don't know if we know the answer, but Danielle, do you have anything?
No, I just want to add that we are aware of the microplastic effects on all the water, soil, and biota, but as of today, I don't think the Park Service is actually monitoring microplastics. I think there are independent studies. Say university researchers are going to parks to collect samples for microplastics, but that's something that the Park Service is not doing consistently, and there are no monitors to actually analyze that, and we did not include that in the report either.
Okay, and then last question as well, or at least last question I'm seeing right now, are shrinking glaciers in Alaska national parks addressed as a significant concern in terms of impact to nature? I know there is a broader data set on the climate pieces. Do you want to answer that one, Danielle?
Sure. Yes. I don't. I'm not sure if I'm understanding the wording correctly, but when we talk about shrinking glaciers, that's a climate change issue, and impact to nature. What we looked at when we say harm to nature is actually the impact from air pollutants on nature. So I think I understand the overall perspective, but those are two different things that we looked separately in our report. And in the way we did look at it in the report, I couldn't answer. So one thing doesn't correspond to the other, even though we know that if glaciers are shrinking, there are significant impacts on nature. But that's something we did not address in this particular report.
Great, thanks. Okay, Chuck is asking, are there opportunities for various partners, Chamber of Commerce, visitor bureaus, state parks to engage with both NPCA and NPS to get a better understanding of how heat impacts the visitor experience? I'm not sure. I think that's an interesting question. Might be one for us to take back to some of our colleagues to see if there are intersectional opportunities. Natalie, you haven't had a chance to say anything. Do you at this point? Do you have any thoughts on this one?
No, I mean, I'm sure in areas of the country where there is high heat, often summertime, there's, coordination with local entities around cooling stations and different things for folks so they don't get overheated or get sick or heat stroke. So I'm sure there's some sort of collaboration locally in terms of ensuring the safety of visitors when it comes to heat. But no, I don't I'm not sure exactly what we can do to kind of dig into that more.
Certainly be glad to pass that back to some of our colleagues. Thank you for all the great questions.
Yep.
All right. If there are no other questions, thank you all so very much for joining us today. We really appreciate your time. Phil, should I pass it back to you for closing?
Sure, yeah, thank you so much. It's, you know, working for the National Park Service, we worked with NPCA for decades. And it's been a great partnership. And I thought back to the question about the data and whether or not the data was accurate. And I can tell you from firsthand experience, the people who are collecting this data are very dedicated to making sure that the data is accurate and unbiased. And they share it widely, and it's tested by the states and local cities and companies and factories. And so I have a lot of confidence in the data that has been collected. I tried to reach Jim Renfro to see if there was any collection going on about microplastics, but I didn't find him. That's a great idea. And the one question about drought and heat, you know, I bet there are people out there like at the Grand Canyon and Death Valley and other places that could probably answer that question. And my experience with the National Park Service is that they would love to join in a partnership with state parks and other entities to help answer questions such as the one that was raised. So, you know, after working for the National Park Service for 41 years and now about 8 years with the Coalition to Protect America's National Parks, I just want to thank everybody for participating, and thanks to NPCA for putting this on today.
Thanks, Phil. One more piece. I think Teresa's going to launch a poll for anybody attending that would like to get further engaged with NPCA and our advocacy. Please feel free to answer these questions and we'll be in touch. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye. Good
Bye-bye.
job.
Thank
Good
you.
job. Yeah.